Okay, here we are for lecture number 2 in the Cuban Missile Crisis lecture series. So we just finished talking about the domino theory and some of the principles that actually led the United States to have a lot of the philosophies and opinions that they had, which were part of our build-up towards this crisis. So today what I want to talk about is sort of Cuba's story. And that's why, that's kind of part of the title here, is because, what is Cuba's story? What is the story that Cuba tells about their past and their experience that is actually a really critical part of why the Cuban government did what they did during the crisis. And as with anything in history, it's always really important when you're thinking like a historian to consider that oftentimes history is told, the sort of saying goes is that history is told from the perspective of the winner. And I think that's really true. I think you can think of it on many occasions where that's the case. And so it's really critical that we consider not only the perspective of the United States, and then I guess in this analogy, if you're assuming that the United States won the Cuban Missile Crisis, but really, I don't think it's really as easy as saying that. But understanding Cuba's perspective is critical here. So we're going to go back and talk about Cuba in sort of the mid-century. The 1940s, even the 1920s, 1930s, in that time in the 20th century, Cuba over that period of time had really become, in many senses, colonized by the United States. The U.S. doesn't like to call itself a colonial power. We often talk about the British as, the great colonial power. And in fact, the British absolutely had a massive empire, a massive colonial empire. So too did the French. The Belgians, many Western European nations had these colonial empires. But the United States also had a colonial presence. But our colonial presence was primarily in the West, in the Western Hemisphere. Because as we talked about a little in the last lecture, that was our sort of line in the sand, don't cross our line. And Cuba was one of the places, along with places like Puerto Rico, Hawaii, who were dominated in the early to mid 20th century by the U.S. and U.S. Not only politics, government, but also U.S. economic interests. And as far as Cuba is concerned, U.S. economic interests were critical because the vast majority, by the mid-century, the vast majority of companies and property were really owned by U.S. companies. Bacardi rum, companies like Shell Oil, Texaco, these major American corporations, not to mention sugar companies, tobacco companies, had huge economic stakes in Cuba. And like I said just a minute ago, most of the land and companies in Cuba were actually owned not by Cubans, but by American companies. So this is a really critical thing to sort of understand when you look at the picture of pre-revolutionary Cuba. And Cuba, in many senses, was really like a resort of sorts for the United States. When Americans wanted to, party, they went to Cuba. And if you even look at American popular literature and film, in the Godfather films, where do the Godfather's characters go when they want to party? They go to Havana. That's where people in sort of the wealthy upper crust, the mafia, went to Cuba. There were casinos owned by American mafioso in Havana. There were resorts owned by American companies, and that's really where Americans went. A lot of times now, Americans, if they want to party, they go to Mexico. The difference is that in Mexico, the vast majority of property is not owned by Americans and American companies. So imagine if American companies started going into Mexico and just wholly buying up, with the help of the Mexican government, massive amounts of Mexican property. Not only that, but imagine that American companies outnumbered Cuban or Mexican-owned companies. You can imagine that regular Mexicans would probably dislike this, especially because the regular Cubans, many of them were living under pretty oppressive conditions. In the photograph that you see on this slide, you'll see a photograph of some sugarcane plantation workers. Their conditions were brutal. Not to mention the Cubans who were working all over the country, and again, mostly for American corporations. So that's sort of the scenario. But so too, if you look at things like American literature, you can see the influence of Cuba in early 20th century American literature. People like Ernest Hemingway are living in Cuba, writing about Cuba. Sort of Cuba becomes kind of the setting for, in the case of Ernest Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea. So we have this relationship with Cuba that's really complicated. It's sort of a relationship where we really love Cuba. Americans really like to go there, like to enjoy it as a, sort of little resort island. But at the same time, American companies, while they're profiting off of Cuba, the Cubans themselves, the majority of them are not profiting. Now, there were Cubans who were profiting, however, from this American presence. And one of the people who was profiting most highly was Batista. And Batista was the leader of Cuba. He was a pretty brutal military dictator who was getting lots of support from the American government because he was open arms welcoming the U.S. into Cuba. So growing resentment starts to build within Cuba against Batista because of his close relationship, because of the monetary benefits that he's getting from American companies, and the political support also that he's getting. So for years in rural areas in Cuba, there was sort of a rumbling or low-level dislike or disapproval of the Batista government. And again, Batista was, by many accounts, was quite a brutal dictator. And so this sort of low-level rebellion, sort of over the series of several years, begins to firm up and takes on a much more intensified level, to the point where Cuba erupts into full revolution. So the Cuban Revolution begins, and it is just a few years until Batista is overthrown and a new Cuban government comes into place. And the Cuban Revolution is led by a young commander named Fidel Castro. So Fidel Castro is the young 30-something-year-old lawyer with all of these ideas about equality. He is speaking to people, especially in the lower classes, and saying, you've been treated badly, we need to overthrow Batista. And that segment of Cuban society very strongly solidifies itself with Castro, with the revolution. And after the revolution, Castro sweeps into power and takes over the Cuban government. But here's the thing. Castro, this young 30-something lawyer, very idealistic, is upsetting the apple cart, so to speak. I mean, he is, from an American perspective, creating a situation where first of all, our buddy Batista, who had been supporting America within Cuba for many years, is now out. And he's, in fact, in exile, guess where? In the U.S. The Eisenhower administration was none too happy about this circumstance, because not only are they getting, Batista giving him a call saying, like, save me here, but also there are hundreds and ultimately thousands of Cubans who are fleeing the Castro regime out of fear for retaliation. And there was massive retaliation against people who were loyal to Batista. Hundreds of people were killed when Castro came into power. And so we see this huge Cuban exile community begin to leave Cuba and make their way, many of them, to the United States. So, and this is going to become a really important and sort of impactful situation, especially for American politics. Hang on one second. I'm going to check the I'm going to move a slide really quick. I have to move off to the side to do it. I can't see. Okay, sorry. I just had to, because I couldn't see my slides that I'm going to be talking to you guys about. Okay, so we have this exile community. It's leaving. You can see here in this photograph a group of exiles who are flying out. But again, which Cubans are the ones who are free to leave and go to the United States? Especially in this photograph, you know, obviously you're seeing wealthier Cubans. Not all Cubans were getting on Pan Am flights and flying out of Cuba. Many more economically challenged Cubans, people who feared the Castro regime, were getting on boats. And hundreds of people, thousands of people came across on boats to the United States. This next slide that I want to show you is of, it's a graph, actually, it's a map of the United States showing where we have different Cuban communities, specifically wanting to look at Cuban communities around the world. And if you look at Florida, you can see that the Cuban community is quite large, especially in southern Florida. Now, this becomes important later in American politics, and it's one of the reasons why today the United States still maintains this challenged relationship with Cuba. Even though we're talking about events that happened 60 years ago, the United States still has this very strained relationship with the Cuban government, which is still headed by a Castro, not Fidel. Fidel has taken a backseat to his brother, but the United States still maintains this really challenging, like I said, relationship with Cuba. We still have embargoes. You know, you can't fly directly to Cuba from the United States still. And some of that has to do with the power of these Cuban exiles still in the United States. The people who left Cuba in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, because people have been leaving Cuba ever since the revolution in '59. And many of them have converged in southern Florida, and they have a very powerful political bloc in which, you know, American presidents, when they are running, or candidates, I should say, when they're running for president, if you want to win southern Florida, and if you want those electoral votes of Florida, the power of that Cuban vote is really important. And so if you're running for president and you're running saying, well, I'm going to end the block, or I'm going to end I'm going to end this relationship with, I'm going to make the relationship with Cuba better. I'm going to improve our relationship with Cuba, and we're going to start trading with Cuba. People can travel there. The expatriate community in Cuba, I'm sorry, in southern Florida, feels very strongly that this cannot happen. Remember that many of them lost their homes, lost their businesses, because when Fidel Castro took over, not only did he kill many people who supported the Batista regime or who opposed the revolution, and of course, don't forget, some of those exiles knew people who were killed by the Castro regime. But also, what Castro did was he nationalized industry, he nationalized property, and he basically took back a lot of the property that some of the people in that Cuban exile community still believe that they should get back. And so there's a lot of anger that still remains. So if you're running for president of the United States, if you're a candidate and you want to win the electoral votes of Florida, you in some ways still have to appease these voters, these exiles. So it kind of helps to explain how this crisis that's happening in the 1950s and 60s that we've been talking about still has an impact on America today. And it's one of the things that, you know, I'm always trying to sell, like, why is history important? It's because it teaches us why and who we are today. It's not so much about, like, what happened in the past. It has so much to do with who we are today. So here we are, it's 1959, Castro has come into power, he's getting rid of all these people in opposition, people who are exiled, are leaving, and into this time frame, you get Fidel making a trip to the United Nations. The United Nations, headquartered in New York, is having a General Assembly, and Cuba, like all nations, has a voice at the United Nations. So here is Fidel Castro, the new leader. He's the revolutionary leader of this new Cuba, and he comes to the UN, and here's a photograph you're seeing of him, to make a fiery and impassioned speech to the international community, basically saying, here I am, here's our new country, take us seriously, respect the new Cuba. And he knew that he had to kind of convince the international community because, again, Batista had friends. And the United States was one of Batista's greatest supporters. So here is Fidel Castro at the United Nations making this impassioned speech, and he's in New York. So who is he going to give a ring to? He's going to give a ring, or his people call, his people, to Eisenhower. So Eisenhower is still president. There is a presidential election going on. It's 1959, but Eisenhower is still in power. And Eisenhower refuses to meet with him. To understand Eisenhower's position, you have to think about, Castro has nationalized oil refineries. He's nationalized property. He's taken businesses and taken them away from people who were sort of supporters of the Eisenhower administration. And most of those people that he has taken those businesses and that land from are Americans. So, and not only that, all these people are leaving. Batista is in exile in the United States. And so Eisenhower basically says, I'm not going to meet with you. Like, you're basically messing with people who are my supporters. And so into this whole picture comes this moment, this really decisive moment in which Eisenhower refuses to meet with Castro. And we're going to pick up this story and what happens as a result of that in the next segment of lectures. But before I move on, and before you move on to the next lecture, on the next screen what you're going to see is you're going to see a film that is posted. Much of what I have talked about here and some of the other things that I'm going to be talking about in the next lecture are covered in this really great film. It's a film by CNN. It's called the CNN Cold War series. And this is a portion, just part one on this, this Awesome Stories website has posted a whole series of films from the CNN Cold War series. So what I'd like for you to do is I'd like for you to watch just segment one. Just part one. It's going to review a lot of what has been talked about here, and whatever like additional information you want to pull from that video, you can do that. So that that's the sort of the next stage here. Once you're done watching that video, then pull up lecture 3 on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay? Thanks.